And I'm gonna share my screen, and if you guys can't see, let me know, but I think it should be working. Um, look good? Awesome. Okay. So we're going to be talking about approaching practice and oh, we just got another participant. Okay. So I'm going to start off with sort of an overall viewpoint on a learning mindset. Um, I know that like the first instinct as a pianist is kind of after you play or when you're in a lesson or whatever context you're playing is to criticize yourself. That's sort of the first thing that pops into your mind. What did I do wrong? How can I fix it? And while that's like a great instinct to have because yeah, you're going to fix errors, you also need to be able to acknowledge when you do something well because if you can't, then you also don't know what to repeat. So you can be looking for like what to avoid, but you also need to know what am I going to do next time. So approach your playing and your sort of self-critique with a healthy amount of what did I do well? And anyone who's like done lessons with me or Lyle and Amelia both know that I'm always like, what did you like about the performance that you just gave? Secondly, is to cultivate a love and respect for the art itself. Listen to piano music, listen to the music that like inspires the music you're playing. Like Lyle, for example, was playing a variation on a theme by Paganini. And I was like, you should listen to the caprice that this theme is actually from. So sort of explore the art itself. And also reframe I have to statements as I get to statements. So if your teacher is sort of giving you a laundry list of things to do and you're like, oh, I have to like practice this with a metronome and I have to do this slowly and all that stuff, sort of reframe that as I get to study this really old and very complex music with a rich history. I get to do this. Um, and I think one of the most important things about a learning mindset is to be able to engage in a dialogue with your teacher. Lessons shouldn't just be like you nodding along to everything they say. I feel like a lot of students, like definitely me included, have this instinct where if they don't understand what a teacher is saying in a lesson, they just sort of nod and they're like, oh yeah, I know what that word, that Italian word that you just said means. When in reality, we're like, what? I have never heard that before. And we're like whipping out Google and trying to figure it out. Don't be afraid to be like, I don't understand. Because a teacher's role is to make you understand and to help you to figure things out and eventually to teach yourself. So there's nothing wrong with being like, that doesn't make sense to me. And I hear this a lot from a lot of students sort of in the high school age range where they're like, I want to play La Campanella or something. And I'm like, that's lovely. But that's like, I like to say there's no such thing as music that's too easy. A lot of students will shy away from like sonatinas or something like that because they feel like it's too easy and they want to immediately play Rachmaninoff's like third piano concerto. And while like it is a lovely piece of music, that might not be the smartest thing. I think that like people don't really give a lot of credit to like a Scarlatti sonata, for example, because it's deceptively complex music, simply because you can't hide. That's what I say about Mozart and Scarlatti and Haydn is there's not a lot of notes to hide in. So if you mess something up or like if something's not really like there, it's a lot easier to tell than maybe something that's sort of sweeping and has a lot of notes. So something that has a very thin texture, while it might appear on the surface that, oh, that's sort of easy to read off the page, it's got its own unique challenges and there's no music that's too easy. So if your teacher is giving you music and you're like, no, I want to play Chopin's Second Piano Concerto, maybe find what is uniquely difficult about that music and see that as a challenge. And the last point is I like to keep a written record. And this sort of leads into one of the main things about this presentation I'm giving, which is practice journaling. Does anyone here keep sort of a record of like what they do when they practice? Show of hands, anyone? No, okay, awesome. That means I have something to tell you guys. Um, so we're gonna look at some different kinds of formatting for practice journals and for lesson journals. So I'm gonna start off with lesson journals. Um, I've taken lesson notes since I was like 14 years old. And I've taken them in a lot of different ways. When I first started taking them, I was just typing them on my notes app on my phone. And eventually I started taking them in a physical notebook where I'd write them down. And you can kind of see on the screen here, there's like, I've divided it by piece, and it's sort of like, what did we cover in the lesson? I went ahead too fast. You can see like Mozart Sonata, it's divided by the movements, like what we worked on and like what the teacher expects me to have accomplished by the next lesson. This was sort of a more sparse way that I kept lesson journals. This was when things got a little crazy. I started using an iPad to like actually annotate on the scores. I use the app GoodNotes. It's super great if you have like, I think it's like $20 to spend and an iPad. I use it every day. And this was really a huge game changer to me because I liked to sort of circle. You can see I'm sort of circling specific places in the score, giving them little reference numbers, and then writing what my teacher told me about those sections in the side so I can reference it. And it just creates a really like nice sort of book of all of the exercises and advice and little tips that your teacher gives you in your lesson. And I actually like to use it not only for my reference, but I will sometimes send it to the teachers that I've taken lessons with. So like if I'm at a festival or something like that, where I'm taking lessons with a teacher who's not my private lessons teacher, I might send them my notes from that lesson and be like, hey, did we understand the same thing here? Was there like something I missed or misinterpreted? And I also would send those lesson notes to my regular private lessons teacher and be like, here's what this teacher told me. What do you think? I've also taken notes typed. It's a little harder to annotate a score, but it's not impossible. And OneNote is actually a free app, so that's a plus. Mostly when taking lesson notes, I found that I didn't really reference them so much as writing it down in the first place is what helped it stick in my mind. Because when you set out to write lesson notes, you're like, okay, well, what am I writing down? I think primarily it's going to be what assignments is my teacher giving me? Like, oh, get this done by next week. What competitions or recitals or deadlines do I have in the distance? And what technical exercises did my teacher sort of prescribe for specific problems that I'm having in the music? So like if your teacher's having you play something in like dotted rhythms to help you with a run, write it down and sort of add that to your toolkit. So this is like a zoom in of what the typed ones would look like. I could just screen cap like a PDF of the score and just import it in. It takes a little, tech skills to sort of figure it out, but there's a lot of ways that you can take notes for your lesson, and it can be completely personal. I also like to record my lessons. I'll put my phone on the piano and just set a voice memo going so that I can listen back. And if you combine that with note taking, you can just have your headphones in and just be writing things down as you're listening back to it. So that's sort of just a lot of information. I've been told that I talk really fast. So if you guys have any questions, like feel free to just like jump in. So that's sort of the lesson aspect of it. Let's talk about everyone's favorite thing in the whole wide world, practice. So the way I like to approach the technical side of practicing is I like to have a plan. I don't just sort of sit down at the piano and be like, whatever happens, happens. Sometimes I do, but most of the time when I want to be very productive, I come in with a concrete plan. I like to write it out usually. I like to time it out, and I'll show you guys a little bit more specifically how I do that later on. But I also like to make sure that the space that I'm going to practice in is sort of it's a calm and like meditative space. Because for me personally, that's what helps me focus, is if I feel comfortable, if I don't feel stressed, if there's not a lot of distractions around me. And that's sometimes hard if you live with your family and you might have a lot of siblings. I have 4 siblings, so it was definitely difficult. But try and find sort of a routine and a time where you can make your practice space the most comfortable for you. And when then you get to the practice, you will feel better just overall. Another thing that I like to keep in mind is if I can't describe in like a sentence what I've accomplished after a practice session, then it wasn't quite as productive. And I also like to view practice as sort of an opportunity to discover things, because our ability to look at this very complicated and rich music and to look for the composer's intentions and these really cool things that they might have sort of hidden in the details, like articulation markings or dynamic markings, or something written in French that you never thought to translate, and then you do, and you're like, wow, this is a game changer, because I had no idea what that meant because I don't speak French. So it's sort of an opportunity to be like, what can I discover and learn about this music that I didn't know before? And I feel like, a piece is almost like a person. I feel like I'm getting to know a person when I practice a piece, and I like to be very diligent and try and learn everything I can about that person and its character. I think one of the most important things when you're structuring your practice session is to make sure that you have sort of a lot of small goals instead of like one giant goal. So for example, instead of it being like, oh, I want to memorize this whole piece. It's like, yeah, eventually we'll get there. But in the 30 minutes that you might have to practice, how are we going to take smaller steps to get to that larger goal? So for example, you might say, I'm going to memorize the right hand of, line 1 of page 1 in the next 5 minutes. And then when you achieve that, it actually gives your brain sort of like a dopamine hit, and you feel good about yourself, and then you feel a little more motivated, and then just keep doing that. And before you know it, after half an hour, you've got about 2 pages memorized or something like that. And that's a little more concrete than sort of trying to aim for a whole piece and sort of getting discouraged because it's taking a while. There's a lot of psychology research behind that idea of having small goals and achieving them, because that's sort of the key to help yourself keep going and keep being motivated towards a larger goal. Because you do need to feel good about what you're doing, and that's what will motivate you to go forward. Another thing sort of relates to the small goals is you work in small chunks. Even if it's like a giant piece, like a concerto, to start out and to work in chunks that you feel very manageable. Could even be a measure, could even be half a measure, whatever feels achievable in that practice session and in that moment is where you start. And then once you get that small section, there's a small goal that you've achieved, you can check it off of your to-do list, and then you move on to your next small chunk and small goal. And I think that you'll find that it sort of stacks up a lot quicker than you might think it does. And sort of just overall things to keep in mind whenever you practice. You should always have at least a little time devoted to hand-separate work and counting out loud and playing with the metronome. It's not an either or when it comes to counting out loud and playing with the metronome. You should do both. You should do them together, and you should do them separately. This is because when you practice with the metronome, that's sort of an objective thing that's keeping time for you. So if you mess up on the piano, metronome's going to keep going. You're not sort of feeling that pulse internally, it's external. If you're counting out loud, the counting's going to stop if you mess up. So that sense of pulse is internal. And to be able to produce a consistent sense of pulse without the metronome is going to be necessary if you want to play something in time. It's also really useful to count out loud if you want to insert a little rubato which is an Italian term. It means, to sort of the give and pull, to sort of slow down somewhere or to speed up a little. It's like playing with the tempo a little. Counting out loud gives you that kind of freedom that working with a metronome might not so much. But I would say like those are the big three to keep in mind whenever you practice: hand separate, count out loud, metronome. Invariably, when I go into a lesson and I'm having trouble with a section, my professor's like, have you done it hand separate? Have you done it counting out loud? Have you used the metronome? And I'm like, no. And he's like, then do that. So I would always encourage it. And I'm not perfect. I don't do it every time, but I try. And then recording yourself. For me, that was one of the biggest like game changers. Is I just set my phone up in the corner of the piano and I would record in like very little sections, and I would listen back with the score in front of me and the ability to see my hands and see my hand position and to read the score without the distraction of trying to play it at the same time, like makes you notice things that you didn't notice before. And I think one of the most humbling things I ever did with a recording of myself was I set a metronome against a recording of myself where I wasn't playing with the metronome, and it very quickly was not with the metronome. So maybe try that on pieces that you're having tempo problems with, and you might be like, oh, wow, it's like the first measure, then we're off. So just other ways to sort of evaluate what you're doing. So next we're going to talk about time management, everyone's favorite topic. Up here you can see sort of some examples of practice days and how I sort of broke them down. Keep in mind I was homeschooled, so I had a lot of time that I could organize myself on weekdays, for example. So this might not apply to some people who might not have those kinds of schedules. But just sort of examples. So these are blocked out in 30-minute segments. As you can see, it's like the one on the far end says it starts with major and minor scales, etc. And arpeggios, broken chords. I like to have a warm-up period sometimes. Usually if I warm up, just like right before a practice session, if I have very little time, it's like I'll play a few scales. But if I have like a lot of time, I like to take anywhere between half an hour to a full hour just playing scales, arpeggios, broken chords, whatever. And then I break down very specific goals. So you can see it says prelude, RH, which means right hand. And I say M and M. For me, that means metronome and memory, page 1. So I would set that goal for myself. And one way that I would keep myself accountable is I'd be like, I want to get a recording of this that I feel like is good enough for me. So set my phone up and start recording. And when I can get a good recording of the right hand with the metronome by memory of page 1, then I move on. And I set these sort of time goals where I'm like, I have half an hour to accomplish this, because I don't want to just spend the entire day just trying to get, the right hand of that page memorized. If it gets to the half hour and it's just not sticking, I'm like, okay, let's move on. I have done something, but I don't want to just keep banging my head against the wall trying to get this to work. And schedule in breaks. I was preparing for auditions and stuff from these samples that you see here. So it was sort of more intense practice. But if you're going to practice for, 3 hours a day or something, I would break that up into small chunks, take time to drink water, make yourself coffee, have a snack, go on a walk, pet your dog or something, because your brain will get tired and you need, I don't know if anyone's sort of heard of the term spaced repetition, but it's this sort of learning theory where you need to you work on something a little bit and you repeat it a few times and then you just back away. Give yourself time to sort of forget it. And then you come back maybe half an hour later or something, or an hour later, do the same thing. And it's actually more effective for memory and recall than sitting there for an hour straight, just drilling the same thing over and over again. Sometimes I don't plan as crazy, like 30 minute by 30 minute as this. On the other side, you can see there's just sort of a to-do list. And I like to put exclamation marks next to the things that I feel like are like most important. So like Schumann, fifth section, blah, blah, blah. And I would just sort of check them off as I go. So, when you're creating these plans, there's a lot of ways that they could look, and you can go through a lot of sort of trial and error of what, you like to do, how you like to organize. But at the very least, I feel like piece of paper, a to-do list of what you need to accomplish that day is a great place to start. And if you want to do the sort of timed planning thing, it will take a little while for you to learn how long it takes you to do something. So you might sort of schedule half an hour for something that you discover it takes you 10 minutes to accomplish. And then you sort of write that down and you lock it away in your head and you're like, okay, next time I'm planning a similar thing, I'm going to set it for 10 minutes instead of half an hour. So just things to think about. So practice journals, in a very similar sense to lesson journals. You can do it by hand, you can do it on your phone. There's lots of ways. I've done all of the above. You can see the handwritten one. I would just sort of calculate how many hours that I practiced. I just set, the stopwatch running on my phone. I'd say, how much I spent on each piece and then what I was doing in those pieces. So that sort of ties back into, can you describe what you accomplished? Sometimes it would just be like, I ran it through or something like that. But if you were like, I don't really know what I did, then you're like, okay, let's take a step back. Was I playing or was I practicing? Because there is a difference between those two. Practicing is sort of a productive, analytical playing of the music. And playing is sort of just like, I'm going to play what I have and how I have it without an analytical point of view. I like to set specific metronome markings a lot. You can see that with the Chopin ballade that I have up there. And I also use the app Andante, which I cannot recommend more. There's a free version and there's a paid version. The free version has lots of great features. I use the paid version and it's one of my favorite apps of all time. You can get a practice streak going. You can track exactly how many hours. You can track your mood, your focus, and you can record. I think on the premium version only, you can record little snippets and stuff. You can see some of them are like, oh, I just worked on this piece. And then some of the notes are like measure 173 to measure 183. Did it hands separate and hands together up to 72 decently. So these are examples of how you can sort of set those goals. They can be broad, like I just want to run the piece, or they can be very specific. I want, this set of measures to be at this tempo marking, and I'm going to set up my phone and I'm going to record it. For me, I found a lot of motivation in posting videos online. A little promo for my Instagram account. It's briggs.practice.room if anyone wants to go follow, but I've done the 100 days of practice challenge. I think 3 or 4 times. I've lost track. I also did 365 days of practice. And I think some other practice challenge, but I found it really motivating to sort of have this place where I was sharing what I was doing, and there were lots of musicians online who would find my account and they were like, this is super cool. And then they were doing their own practice challenges, and to sort of have that external motivation where some days I'd be like, I don't want to practice. And I'd be like, I'm going to do 30 minutes. I'm going to set a small goal. I'm going to record it, and then I'm going to post because there are people out there who want to watch those videos. So that's just an idea. I find social media is a really great tool if you're using it well and in a way that serves you, because you can connect with people who you would have otherwise not met. So next we're gonna get into more of the nitty-gritty, I think, of practice, which is a question that I feel like a lot of people have. I know that I've had this question, which is what is technique? because you hear people talk about it like, oh, that pianist has great technique, or you need to work on your technique. But what does that really mean, and how do you do that? So I like to sort of divide technique into two categories, which is firstly stuff like your major and minor scales, your major and minor arpeggios, diminished and dominant seventh chords like broken chords. And you find a lot of this and other exercises like it in books like the Alexander Peskanov Russian Regimen. It's a really great series that I personally use very often. And there's like etude books, not like a Chopin etude, but like an etude that's meant to teach you something, like Czerny and Hannon. And they're great for developing agility and developing facility in your fingers and getting you sort of used to patterns that appear a lot in piano music. So that's why we practiced our scales, because the fingerings and the arpeggio fingerings and all this stuff, it appears in our repertoire, and it's going to help you to be able to play quicker when you can recognize those patterns. Because unless you're playing, atonal music, you will be running into those patterns. The second category is more so like things that you do depending on your personal strengths and weaknesses and the repertoire you're playing. So one example is voicing exercises with chords. So if you're trying to voice a melody line, that is, you're playing a triad and the top note is the melody, to sort of take the time to just play all the triads you can think of and practice. You play the first two and you play them very softly, the third below, and then you play the top very loudly, and then you practice just that, and then you practice playing all three notes at once and you listen. It's a sort of a practice in listening, and you do that through a lot of major and minor and in different inversions of triads. And you don't have to do this every day. You can do it maybe once a week or something, but to take that time to not only work on agility, but also on how is that sound coming out. Another example is making up exercises within a piece. So if you have like a particularly difficult run in a piece, I don't know if you guys have done this, have had a teacher tell you to sort of play it in rhythms where instead of it being like da 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 da, it's like da 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 da, and reverse. That's a great way to sort of have your brain process the notes differently. There's a lot of examples of that kind of thing. And that's the sort of thing that when you're taking your lesson notes, you should write down. Where if your teacher's like, okay, in this section, since we're having trouble with finding the notes, this is what we're going to do. We're going to play the chord 3 times, and then we're going to jump to the next chord and play it 3 times. Another example of something you're like, okay, when I have trouble doing this, I do this. So exercises within pieces. Another thing that falls into this sort of second category of technique for me is avoiding painful movement. It shouldn't hurt to play the piano. I hear this sometimes from students where they're like, it's just, this piece hurts so much to play. This is so physically painful. I'm like, it shouldn't be. You should find a way to hold your hand and to play a passage where you don't have tension and you don't then lock. And then that causes pain to sort of run down through here. And locking up and not having a loose and supple wrist movement is, I think, one of the most common sources of pain and injury that I've seen in students and that I've also sort of experienced myself. And so this is where recording yourself really comes in handy, where you can set up that phone and then you watch back and you're like, is my wrist locked? Is it just not doing anything? Is it straight? Do my hands look tense? And then trying to loosen up. I like to do this a lot. Just loosen up, try again, watch your wrist, watch that movement, and make sure that your elbow isn't sort of locked in like this, but that it's out and it's free to move around. And there's a lot of things about that part of technique that is personal. My professor says this a lot, where he's like, if your sound is good, and you feel physically good with what you're doing. Sometimes if it may not look like traditional pianistic technique, but he's like, I wouldn't touch it. That's his philosophy. Sounds good, feels comfortable, you're not facing any technical problems. No need to change it. There's not so much a correct technique as there is a technique that works for you. I think some teachers might disagree on that, but that's sort of the school of thought that I've been raised in. So focus on finding comfort. Now, there are some scenarios in music where a chord might not work well for your hand shape. And that's where having the knowledge of knowing that you can drop a note if you have small hands, or you can roll a chord if you have small hands. And sometimes if you're playing music that wasn't written by an actual pianist or is an orchestra reduction, you may find writing that actually wasn't really written with the piano in mind and what's sort of physically possible in mind. So that's another element of when you're playing music and you're like, this is just feels wrong and I can't reach that and it's hurting and I'm tense, to sort of ask your teacher, hey, can I roll this chord instead of playing it? Or can I drop this note out because my hand's locking up and I feel pain? Don't be afraid to be like, this does not feel good, because your teacher can't know what you're physically feeling. They only can sort of see and guess by the tension that they're seeing, or they can only know what you're telling them. Because injury is not fun to deal with. So the minute you feel that tension and that pain, be like, something needs to be different. Another thing that falls into the second category is practicing sort of dynamic ranges. Another thing that you don't really need to do every day, but maybe every once in a while, where you sit at the piano and you just like take one note. You can do it up and down the piano, just one note. And you sit there and you're like, okay, I'm gonna play the most dolce, pianissimo note that I possibly can. You go with that, you're like, okay. You keep playing until you get it, and then you try and replicate it a few times. And then once you feel secure at that, you're like, okay, now I'm gonna just move up the volume just a hair. And you just sort of keep doing that and practice those shades of which that you can play that one note. Sort of do that up and down the piano, and you can also do that with chords. You can be like, okay, I want to practice this chord is very soft, but the top note's loud. Or the outer notes are very soft, but the inside note is very loud. Or the bottom note is very loud. Sort of practice that control over the sound production. And I think like the biggest advice for playing softly is don't be scared of notes not sounding, because pianos are all different. They're all fickle. It depends on how well taken care of they are. Sometimes you will try to execute a technique that has worked very well on pianos you're used to, and it just might not work on another piano. And that's sort of the cross that we bear as pianists, which is we just have to cross our fingers and knock on wood and hope that wherever we're playing is providing a good enough piano. But don't be scared of notes not sounding, because they might not. Whatever. I mean, at the grand scheme of things, it's not the end of the world. They might not sound, but there's also an equal chance that you will play with that softness and it will sound, and it will be that very soft pianissimo dolce sound that you want. So don't be afraid to sort of make that bet with fate, because the piano life is, just hoping that you get a good piano. I know that I got very used to the piano that I have back home, and now that, I've been in school for 2 years, sometimes like you play on pianos that haven't been serviced in multiple years, and you're like, it's fine. I'll just deal with this. And this last sort of point on technique is when your teacher gives you some kind of exercise to do, it should sort of go under this imaginary toolbox in your head, which is your technique toolbox. So if they're like we said, exercises in a piece, or if they're, giving you a voicing exercise or something, write it down. And next time you face a similar problem, you look through your notes and you're like, we did this last time. Let me do that, so that my teacher doesn't have to repeat themselves when I go into my next lesson. So the next and sort of final point here is on motivation. And it's like sort of a lot of information that I've given in this session, and it comes from, a lot of years of doing this. And throughout the years, I've had moments where I'm like, I don't want to practice. I don't feel the motivation. I'm tired. I have homework. I've got all these things. And I've sort of discovered a few ways to approach practice that have helped me find more motivation. The first one, which I feel like is probably one of the most important things to me, is be cautious of what headspace that you allow yourself to come to the piano in. And for me, that, like, my professor has told me that you can practice a sense of stress into a piece, and you can practice fear and anxiety into a piece. So things I like to do before I practice is to meditate for 5 to 10 minutes, or to just take a second to just try and breathe and think, am I practicing from a place of anxiety? Am I practicing from a place of, care for the music? Or am I mad right now? Like, what am I feeling? And to be present in that feeling and to think, do I want this feeling to sort of be ingrained in the music that I'm about to work on? Do I want this feeling to become associated with the piano, for example? And if you find that the answer is no, you're like, okay, I'm gonna take a minute. I'm gonna go on a walk. I'm gonna, drink a cup of coffee or something non-caffeinated, and I'm gonna, chill. And then once you feel better and you're like, this is a feeling that I wouldn't mind bringing to the piano, then you're ready to practice. And I know that that's kind of an ideal scenario, because sometimes you're stressed because you need to practice. But try your best to put yourself in a position where you feel capable of focusing and not from a place of sort of fear or anxiety. And then that's something that I struggle with, which is why I'm focusing on it, because I can only speak from, my experience. And your guys' experiences are all unique. So take what I say and think, does this apply to me? And if it doesn't, that's fine. If it does, yay. And the second thing is to listen to the music, to truly find enjoyment in piano music, and not only piano music, orchestral music and solo music for other instruments. Being at a university with a large school of music has made me discover that I enjoy some music that I didn't really even think about ever in high school, which is like solo trombone music. And like, I've seen some really cool electronic stuff. And there's just a lot of instruments that I never thought about as having really solid solo repertoire, like the euphonium, for example. Some really beautiful euphonium music is out there. A good friend of mine is a really amazing euphonium player, and I didn't even know the euphonium was an instrument before college because I was so caught up in the solo piano world. So don't be afraid to explore other music. And if anyone wants any recommendations on other music, just let me know. Because I know a lot, like most of my friends are actually brass players, believe it or not, which is funny. And they're always asking me to accompany them. That's, if any of you want to major in music, be aware that as a pianist, you will always be asked to accompany. And on that note, search out collaborative experiences, especially with your friends. There is nothing more fun than being able to play music with your friends. Half the time rehearsals will be you guys just goofing around, and that's a lovely feeling to associate with your instrument and the music, and to be able to put, that dialogue between the people that you care about into the actual music it's like an unparalleled experience. Some of my like fondest memories performing have been in chamber music and collaborative experiences. And there's sort of less stress to it, I think, sometimes because you're surrounded by people, so you feel more comfortable on stage. And also, there's not an expectation that you have to have it memorized, so that's sort of a little easier. So do a lot of collaborative work. And if you don't find that there are people around you that you can play with, attend festivals if you have the ability to do so. I would highly recommend it. I know that Elizabeth, she's probably told you guys about McNiff, which I've attended and I've also helped teach at. And that program is really wonderful. You can apply there. I also teach at the George Mason Summer Piano Academy. It's in Virginia. We do a lot of really cool stuff. So search out those opportunities because you might be surprised just how awesome it is to have a musical community. Because there's people that you can just talk to. You can text a friend and be like, Tchaikovsky is just really annoying, isn't he? And then you can argue about it. And it's really wonderful, I think, to have friends who also know the music that you're playing. And that's why I love social media and I love, posting about music and stuff, because I meet all these people where we can just talk about composers and piano music and viola music and euphonium music. So seek it out. And also explore the wider context of the music you're playing. So Debussy, for example, if you're playing any Debussy, he considered himself a symbolist, which was sort of an aesthetic philosophical movement. And he was really inspired by the paintings of James Whistler. I think his first name is James. I know his last name is Whistler. And if you are playing the music that was inspired by it, go find an art museum somewhere that has a Whistler painting or look it up online and sort of experience that and read some of the writing that's associated with it. Like Clair de Lune was inspired by a French poem. Go read the poem. And having a wider sense of how the music you're playing matters and how it fits into the culture and the context and history, it gives you a more like potent sense of like what you're doing. And for me, that's a huge motivation, because it's not just that I'm playing, Debussy. It's that I'm participating in this, almost lost philosophy and engaging with this art form that was, so long ago. And then something a little more concrete and less in the abstract is establish habits that just keep up your technique. So for me, I play scales and arpeggios almost every day. And whether or not I sort of feel in the mood to practice, it's sort of like eating your vegetables or, the routine of having a cup of coffee in the morning where you just do it. And you don't really think about it much, and it's just there to sort of give yourself this baseline of how often you approach the piano and how sort of established that habit is. And my last point on this, because I want time to actually hear from you guys and what you think, is this idea of musical safe spaces, as I like to call them, which is, for me, that's a handful of pieces that I've learned for fun, or that I've learned and I have a lot of love for, because of where I learned them or who I learned them with, or a good performance I had, or a fond memory. And I like to visit those pieces every once in a while to just sort of get that feeling back. There's like a specific Chopin nocturne that means a lot to me that I revisit sometimes. And whenever I play it, I'm like, yeah, this is why I love the piano. To find that music for you. Like one of those pieces for me is actually a Billy Joel song. And I just find what works for you. It could even be just listening, but to have a musical experience that is sort of divorced from any sense of stress or any sense of like, oh, I have to do this, can be very useful. Well, that's all that I've got for the presentation. So now I want to hear from you guys a little bit. What do you guys think? Do you have any thoughts, comments, concerns? Questions? Compliments, even? And don't be shy. I can tell it.
Um,
There we go.
I just wanted to say I agreed with the right headspace when
Mhm.
you talked about that. Because that's my biggest problem. Is it um whenever I don't want to play, is it, and then when I make a mistake, I get really upset, and it's just the whole practice doesn't go very well. Um, so I think that would be a really useful thing for me. Just to make sure that my practice goes well overall.
Yeah, I also struggle with that a lot. And it's been like a big thing for me lately, which is trying to figure out how I can approach the piano without feeling overwhelmed. Because I also, like, if I start making mistakes, I'm like, why? And I get really frustrated. And I was telling my professor this at one point, and he just goes, "You're too smart to let yourself get frustrated." And that just pops into my mind every once in a while. I'm like, I am too smart to let myself get frustrated. And you're too smart to let yourself get frustrated. So when that feeling comes up, now I'm just sort of like, why would I do this? I'm smart enough to know that this is not productive. And it, of course, doesn't solve the problem. But that hearing that from him in such a matter of fact way, I was like, you've got a point. But yeah, I do struggle with that a lot too. Any other thoughts?
I thought it was really interesting the way that you used like breaks as like a form of like I'm I my motivation is really bad, so I like get here and I'll just play like a free piece or an easy piece, and I'll just like I don't know, do something dumb, and then I don't really have motivation to start. But like the way they used like that you used like breaks and then like small goals, I thought was really interesting and really helpful, kind of for maybe future practices.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean when I do sometimes I will sit down and I'm like I have no idea what I'm doing or like what I want to do. Like I won't lie to you guys, I'm not perfect. But I find that if I'm approaching the piano and that's how I feel about it, I'm like sometimes it's better if I just don't right now. If I maybe take an hour or maybe even if I'm like I'm not doing this today. Because it 1 hour of like really good, motivated, solid, dedicated practice, I think outweighs, 7 hours of practice where you're frustrated or you don't really feel like you want to do it. Um, and when you build and build on positive experiences with the piano, instead of building on negative experiences, you will find yourself more motivated day to day. So if, like Nate said, where he's like, I get frustrated, me too. If you're feeling that feeling, sometimes I'm like, I'm gonna stop and I'm not gonna come back to the piano until I can find a way to resolve that feeling in myself. Good points, everyone. Any other thoughts? No, Lyle, you don't have any thoughts? Okay, Lyle, can you give at least one thought? I'm sure there's at least one thought.
Um, I can't think of anything.
Okay. Amelia, what about you? Any thoughts?
Um, I just thought that the time management and the practice journals were really interesting. Um, I think that that's going to help me with my practice a lot because I don't plan it out beforehand at all. I keep track of how much time I do, but I think it's going to be like really helpful.
Um,
Yeah.
I think it's I like when you said like to um like plan out like the things to do because I've like never planned out anything for my practice. So like it's good to like plan it out and then like you know what you're doing already.
Mhm. Yeah, planning is a big game changer because there was a point where I didn't plan anything either. And I was told by my private lessons teacher at that time, he was like, like the change that you've made in a year is like crazy. Like it's a little mind blowing. I'm like, all I did was just start like writing to-do lists. It's crazy the difference that can make. Sarah, any thoughts?
Hi, I'm Sarah, and this is Lucia, my daughter, who's a cellist. I teach piano to mostly elementary and intermediate students. And I was just thinking a lot about your practice tips, not only for myself, but then also applying that to really young students, like how to help them when they go home. And actually, I loved your like be able to say what you've accomplished in a sentence. Like that is such an easy piece to give any age of kid. Like, what did you do today? Write one sentence and put it in your lesson notes, right? To help them get that sense of accomplishment and that positivity and like feeling like then they can build on it. I thought that was really helpful. I also thought it was great. As Lucia was sitting with me, we were eating dinner and then and listening, and like how applicable it was to her as a cellist. Yeah, go ahead. What did you want to say?
No, I was going to say exactly that.
That okay. I said it.
I think there's a lot of overlap, between a surprising amount of overlap between strings and piano. Because I've worked with a lot of string players, both as a chamber musician and I've like helped coach string players. And like, I think music, like overall, there's just a lot of things that apply no matter what. And sometimes I'm like, disregard what I'm about to say because I'm a pianist and you're like a violinist. But they're like, no, that makes sense. And I'm like, yeah, isn't that cool? But yeah, positivity is, I think that's the most important thing for me as a teacher, is a sense of like finding accomplishment, finding things to be proud of, and finding positive element in your performance. Because I feel like too many times in like the solo classical world and that kind of stuff, there's too much focus on critique and, what did I do wrong and how can I fix it? And I think that's kind of toxic. And this idea that you have to practice, 7 hours a day or something like that. It's like, no, you don't. And you don't have to like work yourself to death. That's kind of how you sort of kill the love of the instrument and the art itself. But if you cultivate really focused and like practice sessions that come from a place of care about yourself and of the music instead of a place of anxiety about accomplishing and getting better, I think that far outweighs 7 hours of practice.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? These are like really good ideas everyone's got. If no one's got anything else, I think we can wrap up in a little bit. So final call. Oh, do I sense a thought coming from over there? No? Okay. Well, it was lovely talking to you guys. And I hope that at least something that I said was useful. Like I said, I talk a lot. I'm from the East Coast, so I talk very fast. But it was really cool to get to talk to you guys. And I hope that I get to talk to you guys again soon. So hopefully I'll see you guys again. And if not, thank you.